Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. For those of you who have been following me for a while, you know that I've been on kind of this journey with the Supernote and e-ink and this idea of having, all of these different ways of engaging with my digital world, but also still using those analog things that I find really important. And with Obsidian, I'm actually able to kind of bring those two worlds together in a really good way. I've been in this world a long time of managing information and building relationships and talking to different stakeholders throughout organizations. I've done everything from municipal government to private sector to public sector to higher education. And there's a lot of information that has to flow through a lot of different people and a lot of conversations that have to happen to make projects work and to get things moving in the right direction. And it's never a one person thing. I know there's a lot of different theories on leadership and the way that information moves, but for me, it's all about the relational piece. I think what's interesting here, though, is I'm not a linear thinker, never really have been. I've always had this kind of, I guess you could say, chasing the ball mentality to where I see something, I need to focus on that for a few minutes, then I run and I focus on something else. And that's why I originally started using paper notebooks so I could capture where I was and whatever I was doing and then go back to that later and find it. What's really cool about that is that it doesn't allow you to be focused on one specific task. You learn that over the years on when you need to focus. But you can also, by doing that switching back and forth, sometimes be more creative. So you may get stuck and you need to switch over so that you can just get into a flow or break where you're stuck. And that to me is why Obsidian is kind of a really interesting way to go about things. So one thing here with Obsidian, and I've shown this view before in my video, the graph view, and the graph is really important because what it does is it connects all the dots. There's two primary ways to use Obsidian, and Nick Milo, Dan Berg, a lot of other people have talked about map of contents, and that's kind of the flow that I choose to use. But then there's also what they call Zettelkasten, and Zettelkasten is basically you just put everything in, and as you're linking things, patterns automatically emerge. The graph just shows you how things connect. For example, you'll see I'm highlighting biology here, and it says that it connects to back to the map of contents, over to Susie Smith, and then the biology meeting and to Joe Smith. And each time we hover over somebody, it draws that connection. But if you look at the map of contents, currently there are only two different things connected. And if we click into that, you'll see why. And so the school and department of biology, it's right here. It's easy to see. And I can click on that. And again, I'll go back to now the biology department, faculty member and meetings. What it does is it helps me kind of blend the two methods. One is very structured. You'll also notice here on the left that I have files. So if I go into university, which is my map of contents, everything that you see on that map of contents is also replicated in my file structure. And you may be asking, well, Ed, why in the world would you do that? What is the thought process behind having both a file structure and the notes? Basically, for me, it's to allow that structured component if I need to access information differently, or it's to allow that flexibility to kind of jump off to multiple points. There may be things that don't exist here in the map of contents. So for example, I'll have a primary note, and in that note, you'll be able to see all kinds of different connections. I'm not going to make an individual file for every one of those different connections in a specific folder. So I'm not going to replicate file access. Let's go into faculty. You'll notice there are no files in faculty right now. But if you go to individual notes, if you go to contacts, you'll see that we have the two people that we have in our system. And those are the notes. And when I go in there, you'll see they're tied to a department, they're tied to an email, and they're tied to a meeting. So Susie is tied to all of those things. She is not under faculty because that may be arranged by department. So let's go ahead into schools and departments and go into biology. You'll see that Susie is here under faculty in biology, but she's not under this faculty tab. And you may not need this faculty folder. You can set up your structure, whatever's easier for you. And I'm still learning. So I've been doing this about 2 months now. And just to switch over really quickly, I'll show you what my vault looks like in my graph. You'll notice the difference here. And I've got attachments turned on, so you can actually do that as well. Or I can turn the attachments off, and it shrinks the graph a little bit and just shows you the note files. But the idea is that over time, more and more things begin to populate. All of this exists on your device. For example, let's go into this note. And when you go down, you'll see that you can show in System Explorer. And when you do that, it's going to pop up and show you exactly where your notes are. Now, one thing that I use and I find really valuable is the Obsidian Sync. I don't have an aversion to paying Obsidian, who's providing this entire product for free, except for add-ons. You don't pay for the product itself. And with Obsidian Sync, you pay a fee, and basically that allows them to move your data between your devices, but then keep a local copy on every device you have. I don't mind paying them to do it because it is seamless. So if you look at Obsidian on my phone, if you look at it on my work computer, or if you look at it here on my desktop PC at home, you're going to see the same information. It updates very quickly, it's end-to-end encrypted, and it just replicates those files in those multiple places. But the idea is that you own, and you can even set your own password key for that encryption. I don't. I allow Obsidian to generate that key, but you can do it, and it works very well. I found that I use plugins, but I don't use as many, maybe as some other people do. I find them interesting, but some of this is just me recreating my mental workflow in real time. So my map of contents is very much driven by my context. For those new to Obsidian, I think that's a really important piece of this, is that it has that flexibility, and you don't have to learn a ton of coding or a ton of specialized keyboard shortcuts to do some of the basic functions. If those basic functions fit you and fit your workflow, you are really in a good space to be able to maintain that with a very low bar to entry. Now, the more complicated you get, the more things you want to do, the more you may run into needing to learn those keyboard shortcuts. It's also important to remember that, and Nick Milo and Dan Burke are great when it comes to showing you how to use keyboard shortcuts. And so they'll open the command palette with keyboard shortcuts. It's important, though, to understand that Obsidian gives you a lot of ways to do this. Again, you'll see I can open the command palette with a click. So if you're used to a mouse-driven system like I am, you can do it that way. Here, if I want to create a new note or a new folder or whatever it is, I can right-click. It gives me that flexibility to be able to engage the software in different ways. I actually saved my Obsidian Vault on OneDrive. So my Obsidian Vault itself, which is that file structure, exists in OneDrive, and then I just use Sync to basically move the information around. And I think that's kind of cool. It provides that backup piece so that I have it on another system, on a cloud-based system. But what you have to do in that case, and this is important to remember, is you also have to save a local copy on your device. So if you're using OneDrive, you can't just have the cloud function. You have to make sure that you save it in and then save those as local files. I would think if you download the Google Desktop application and then pull those files into the local area, you should be able to replicate what I do with OneDrive the same way. The biggest thing is to make sure that the files themselves that you're working with exist on the computer. They'll then naturally sync up and back to your cloud storage system. We're going to create a new note. University leadership. Today we met with, and here's when where you do need to remember some shortcuts. Any kind of a double bracket is going to pull up a menu of different things that you can tag. And so right now, here are the different places that you can do that. You want to do it with the provost of academic affairs. So we met with the provost in academic affairs office. And here you may want to say Susie Smith and Joe Smith. Now, what's interesting about that just sets kind of the original tone of the meeting. And you can go back later and you can add in more tags later as well. But now watch what happens when we go back to our graph. You can see that university leadership populated right here. It automatically tied in academic affairs, Joe Smith, and it didn't catch Susie, and that's what it was. I didn't close the bracket on Susie. Now you'll see that once it goes underlined, so that was user error. Do not blame Obsidian for my user error. Now this is a live link. Now when we go back to that piece, you'll see if I go to the university leadership meeting, all three connections are made. And then I can jump right back into the meeting. So now let's say we had some other things going on and we had a discussion about, and I did this with a specific plugin for the library, so a book search, and say we had a discussion about Change by John Cotter, and we want to pull that in. And again, you hit your enter to have your bracket. It automatically comes in. We can go to that book. We can see, and this would be probably for reference afterwards, we can see the automatic metadata pulled into that book from Google about this new version of John Cotter's book. And a nice thing here too, especially for those of you who may be new to Obsidian, you can always navigate back. So you can always go back to the previous thing just by clicking. But you can also just jump around as well. And with all of these links, you can jump into the different components. I can jump back to Provost and Academic Affairs. I can jump to Joe Smith and Susie. And what's cool about this, now we're going to jump into one more thing that's really neat. So let's say this meeting's already occurred, and now I want to add it to Susie's profile. Basically, it allows a two-way connection. That way I can always go back and find that information. I don't have to remember to go to the university leadership meeting in order to see how I participated with Susie. And again, when I go to this link, it's going to show all of that. But now you'll notice that university leadership meeting also includes this source or this book. I loaded in all of my Supernote files into Obsidian, and then slowly over time, I've been going back and cleaning those up when I have time. So it's something, they exist on the Supernote, they live there, they're in real-time recognition, and I have time. I've spent more time creating my structure, creating my file system, my folder system, kind of moving people where they need to be. And that's why my map of contents is so important for me. And it's changed a few times. You're not just replicating what you've done, you're also thinking through, how can I do this? How can this be a more effective way for me to think through how things should be organized? Originally, I had a separate note for each department, and then that was going to be my departmental map of contents. And it was like, okay, do I really need to do that? And I ended up going back to that structure. So sometimes it's trial and error. But what I didn't do is I had basically a biology faculty note. And that didn't make any sense. So what I did was I created a contacts folder. And then in my map of contents, I created a link to a biology map of contents. And then under that, using this menu structure, and we'll go back here, no, wrong one. We'll go back to the map of contents. Then what I would do, I'll show you this in real time. So let's say university leadership is what we want here. And we've rethought this. And we're like, well, you know what? University leadership is more than just one meeting. And quite frankly, I always put dates with my meetings. So now what I do is instead of this, I would put in a template. And you can turn any note into a template, by the way. And so right now we're going to say that this is a school or department template that isn't 100% accurate. You would probably custom create a template for this, but you could say here there would be leadership because it's a committee. There would probably not be staff, so you would get that out. You would leave faculty. So let's say that our faculty are Sue Smith and Joe Smith. Hit enter. Both of those are there. And let's say, and this is where it gets really neat. So those of you who are brand new, pay attention to this component. Let's say that I'm joining this committee. And I close bracket. Now what you'll notice here, which is really cool, I'm not underlined. So I'm telegraphing a note. I'm basically saying that I'm going to add a new contact here, but I don't have time right now to put that information in. I don't have time to go through and actually create that new contact, but I can go back later and I can enter that information. It's really awesome. Let's say that Susie is the chair of this committee. She exists twice on this particular note, but what she doesn't do is it doesn't really replicate information, but it allows you to have her in both places. Let's say later the leadership changes. I don't want to have to go back and redo a ton of things. All I do is flip out who's on it or if people move. And I can also do down here with, let's do a new heading, which is pound signs and space, and we'll say former members. Now that's just a parking lot for now. It's not anything that I'm going to use, but I could always move someone right down to that former member space and then allow them here as well. Now, if I go here, I've now activated this note. And when I go back to my template, I can do a contact template. It's someone internal, so it's an institutional contact. And then I can put in my title. Now, when you go back, wow, look at the graph. It's already started to move. And again, I don't use the graph. I use it mostly to look at connections. I do have one vault for everything, and that may change. I've thought about separating out between one vault and more. And this is where the power of Obsidian Sync kind of comes in. I can hide specific things. So in the settings, you can choose to hide a specific folder. So since I'm using this folder structure, I can basically select to hide anything in the personal realm when I'm at work so it doesn't become a distraction. But it's all still available. It doesn't show on the graph. It limits its search, but I can still navigate it. And let me give you a reason for why. A lot of times my personal and my professional overlap. And when I say that, it's not that, like, for example, this YouTube is a personal thing. It's a hobby. It's something that I enjoy doing. I'm getting close to 1,000 subscribers, so it's a lot of fun, and it's grown more than I ever thought it might. But at the same time, it also has implications for something that may go into my professional realm. The same thing is true when it comes to I teach. So I teach part-time at other universities other than at Valpo. So again, that I consider to be personal, even though it's quasi-professional. And so it's just, again, it's all about the way you want to handle your information. And there may be a connection that I make by working at 2 other universities part-time with a faculty member there and a faculty member at where I am full-time employed. And I want to make those cross connections between personal and professional. Again, I may change my mind on that, but I think that it's important as you are thinking about doing it to make that work. If you think about the way your life works, you know, what's personal, what's quasi-professional, what's professional, what's family, A lot of that can be solved in one vault if you're so inclined to do so. Say you're an independent contractor and you just work for yourself and you want a folder that deals with your professional life. That doesn't need to be a separate vault. It can be, and then you can rebuild all of that structure around it, but it doesn't have to be. What works for me may not work for you. And I think that's why I'm such a big fan of the Supernote and why I'm such a big fan of this idea of Obsidian, and especially how those two things work together. They work together because they don't force you to necessarily do something that you may not want to do. And that is the beauty of it. If you really wanted to, you could go through and create your Obsidian vault before you ever opened Obsidian just as a file structure, and then create a vault from the folder. So let me show you that really quick. Let me pop back over and I'll show you what that looks like. Down here is where you can kind of manage your vaults here in this left or bottom left corner. And you'll see I've got several different vaults. Yeah, I have a template, which I've kind of put out there in my video that I did on this, and I'll link it in the description here as well. It's just a very basic template for how you might want to think about setting up a vault. When you go to manage vaults, you can create a new vault from scratch, or the second heading here, you can open a folder as a vault. That is really, really cool because the idea is you could basically create all of this just on Windows Explorer and then select that folder and that becomes your vault. The reason I started using it is I saw Nick Milo's videos, and I'm not 100% sure if I ran across Dan Berg or Nick first, but either way, this idea of being able to really decentralize my thinking, and I've mentioned this before, I used to work for a consortium of 14 small liberal arts colleges, and I would meet with 40 or 50 people a week sometimes. And back then I was quite a bit younger and I had almost instant recall. It wasn't complete, but it was pretty good about knowing who was doing what on these individual campuses. So if someone brought up a topic, I could say, oh, these 4 people on these 3 different campuses are also working on that topic. And what's interesting is as I've gotten older, I've realized I can't do that quite as well as I used to. I still can because I'm very relationally driven. You know, I think through conversations, I commit those to memory the best I can, and then I kind of trigger myself to go back and remember details. But Obsidian allows me to basically transfer that analog human brain mapping process into a software so that now I don't have to do that. If I'm making notes or if I'm writing notes on my Supernote and then I pull that in to Obsidian, now that information exists. And I mentioned the example of someone coming into my office the other day, and we were having a conversation about different groups on campus. And they said, well, I wonder who all's involved with A, B, and C, or what the overlap between these 2 departments are. And I was able to pull that up in Obsidian and see that in one department or one major, you had an overlap of 4 faculty, half of the department, into another school. And they were housed in 2 different schools, but you could see that cross-sectionality, those natural patterns that develop over time of engaging and interacting with people. To me, that is phenomenal. It's probably one of my favorite things about this whole process and program. For me, especially in the higher ed world, there's a lot of committees. There are a lot of one person may be connected to a whole bunch of things formally, and I want to capture that as well. But then I also want to have the ability to capture all of those informal things where somebody's just mentioned in a meeting or they just say something, and that doesn't exist in the formal people template unless I go back later and search for it, which when I do cleanup, sometimes I do. To me, the most powerful feature is its ability to capture the connections you know exist, but then help you to move forward into the connections you don't even see while you're in that moment. I don't want to ever be in the position, and I think most of you who've been with me through this journey of creating this channel know that I don't feel like I should tell you to do anything, or that I should tell you there's 100% right or wrong approach, because I don't think that's true. I can tell you what's worked for me. I can tell you based on my conversations with others what's worked for them. But what I can't do is tell you the best way to do it for you. So let's say I did John Cotter earlier, but since I'm a leadership guy, let's look up Greenleaf. And John Cotter's in that space too. So well, let's actually do servant leadership. That might get us there faster. Yep. So Robert K. Greenleaf wrote this book on servant leadership years ago. And it's a really important book in the leadership field. So now what I've done is I went ahead and created a new note just by running a Google search from Obsidian. And the reason I said I wouldn't do this is because I was getting overwhelmed with Obsidian, to Joe's point earlier, and felt like I was trying to do too many things all at once and trying to get it all done. Then I kind of hit that mindset of I can go back and do things slowly and then eventually bring it back around. And I think this is a really important piece. I have a ton of books. I just released a video on, my study and kind of the blend I have between the analog and the digital. And I have a ton of books and they've never really been cataloged. Now, am I going to sit down for, a week and wait and take all of that time to catalog every book I had? No. But if I've got 20 or 30 minutes of downtime, or if, there's a day where I really don't have much going on and maybe the kids have an activity and I'm not going, we've dropped them off somewhere, I could come in and I could start just one off. This is a book I own. I already have it. Now, what's nice about that is maybe, let's bring this full circle, we go back into our university leadership meeting and we also discussed servant leadership. Enter. Now it's that fast. Go back to the map, and there it is. I don't think it's going to be a direct competitor to the Supernote, primarily because it is still a fully functional Android tablet that runs Google Play. And I think that's a little bit different. But at the same time, I think it is going to be important in the space because it does run full Android. And I think that's a really, unique piece to the books platform and experience that we need to focus on. It's really easy to use. I think the compatibility that's missing right now is this idea of you can create a to-do item from a note, but when you do that, it has it doesn't have a backlink. So it'll backlink you to the notebook, but it doesn't tie it to the text that you selected. And if you cross it off in the to-do app, it doesn't eliminate it from the actual notebook. And I think if they could figure out a way to either do a cross line through it or some kind of functionality to where it mirrored in both places, it would be a game changer for how I do tasks and notes. I will say that I use it far more than I thought I would because I'm a Google Task user, and it works really well for especially meeting notes in the minute. So you can circle all of those tasks. If you go to menu and you go to cloud and system, you're going to be able to see everything. Now, the apps for mobile, when you click on that, missed clicking, you'll see that you can get the stable builds here. But now they've made it so that you can get the release here. And this used to say beta. This is actually saying it's a stable release. So they may be bypassing this completely at this point and just going through their own e-ink app store. Once you download this, there's an update now button that you can use and check for updates on the device. And you can also enable automatic updates. But this is where you would download it. Now, when you go to install it, it is going to be an APK file, and it is going to make you bypass the Google security to download and install on your device. Basically, you have to allow it to download and install the APK file. On the desktop version, it's the same thing. So you go to Cloud, and you go Partner App for Desktop, and then when you come through here, you'll see the version, and this used to say beta. And when you click on that, it'll download it. They just released the Mac OS. So I think it's really important to know that they do have that for both now, and they're working on the iOS app for the mobile partner app. But that's where I found that and where I downloaded it. I had a friend who had a Remarkable, and I was actually able to write on it. Actually could test that one. I could write on it, feel how it felt, liked it a lot. I still think for certain people it's the best device out there. But I watched My Deep Guide with Voya. I watched Brandon Boswell. I watched Kit Betts Masters. I watched anybody I could get my hand that I could pull up their videos for to figure out the best thing to do. And I've never been unhappy with that decision. I don't see an e-ink device ever doing all of that. Books is trying in the short term. Now, I'm not saying it won't ever happen, because a decade ago, none of this would have happened. Even 5 years ago, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. But I think that until we get to a colored technology that's more along the lines of the gallery with the processing power to actually make that work, I don't think you're going to see color catch up. And the refresh rates, you're going to have a ton of processing power to make that work and make it a seamless experience. The same is for most of these apps. If you try to use OneNote on the Supernote, even through sideloading, it's awful. If you try to use it on books, it's not great. You basically write through the book's interface, and then it translates it into OneNote. The same thing on BigMe, which actually seems to have a little bit better experience with OneNote, but it's still not seamless. And I think that the more we start going down this path of, well, I want an everything device, I think the more we risk running into specific roadblocks. And the Supernote to me is for writing, it is for reading, and it is for times when I'm going to have light. I don't want a backlight on it. I want it to be a productivity device. And when I'm being my most productive, generally is not in bed reading a book. I have a Kobo for that. Now, the Supernote allows me to have all that cross compatibility. So on my device, I have one external web browser, which is Opera, which I found was the best third-party one to download. It runs the best of all of them. But I still have the Supernote as my default. And I have Kobo, Kindle, which comes pre-installed, and I have the Libby app, and I have Nook. That's it. I don't have other installed apps. I don't want to install Obsidian on there. It doesn't give you root access to the drive, and I don't really see the need with the plugin. I want to thank you. Until later, I will see you soon.